Lord Raglan's orders are that the cavalry should attack immediately.
Attack, sir! Attack, attack, attack! Attack what? Attack where?
Balaclava 1854, a pivotal battle in the Crimean War with a very well-known cavalry charge. Into the Valley of Death and all that stuff. Well, that's not the story we're telling today. Instead, we're looking at the deeds behind Tennyson's other famous poem, The Charge of the Heavy Brigade. Let's have a little clip. The trumpet, the gallop, the charge, and the might of the fight. Thousands of horsemen had gathered there on the height, with a wing pushed out to the left and a wing to the right, and who shall escape if they close? But he dashed up alone through the great grey slope of men, swayed his sabre and held his own like an Englishman there and then. All in a moment followed with force, three that were next in their fiery course, wedged themselves in between horse and horse, fought for their lives in the narrow gap they'd made, four amid thousands, and up the hill, galloped the gallant 300, the Heavy Brigade. Exciting stuff, isn't it? These lads were hard as nails, but their impressive charge has almost been forgotten to history. Well, not anymore. So if you recently saw my film on the 93rd Highlanders and the Thin Red Line, then you should have an understanding of the battle. If not, let me just fill you in as briefly as possible before we get down to the action. Picture this. Sevastopol is under siege by the British, French and Turks. The Russians, though, are keen to break the siege, and on the morning of the 25th of October 1854, a large force swings south and attacks the Allied positions near their supply base at Balaclava. It's not looking good for the Allies until those kilted heroes of the 93rd step up and smash a Russian cavalry assault with the help of the new Minié rifled muskets. It's classic stuff, recently covered here on the channel. But the Russians still had plenty of fresh cavalry positioned on the high ground and ready for a scrap. This is where the lads of the British Heavy Brigade come into the story. Now, just briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, with cavalry you had a light and a heavy. Light would be hussars and lancers, that sort of thing, think dandies on light horses. Their speciality would be reconnaissance, screening, pursuit, skirmishing. Think of them as the cavalry's eyes and ears, and sometimes the scalpel. The heavy cavalry, on the other hand, are shock troops. Their job was to smash enemy formations with sheer weight and force. Big men, big horses, keen to cave your skull in half with a heavy sword. Now, the brigade was made up of elements of the Inniskilling Dragoons, the 1st Dragoon Guards, the 4th and 5th Dragoons and the Scots Greys, and it was under the command of Major General James York Scarlet. Scarlet was now 55 years old and had been commissioned in 1818. He'd been a cornet in the 18th Hussars, and 12 years later he became a major in the 5th Dragoon Guards, whose colonel was none other than Sir John Slade. Regulars of this channel will know the name, as he was hardly a good role model for a young officer. Slade had served in the Peninsular War and was described as an officer of limited ability, lacking initiative and nearly useless. He was also called a damned stupid fellow. In 1840, Scarlet took over command of the regiment, a position he held for over a decade. By 1854 he was close to retirement after, let's be honest, a pretty boring career in which he'd seen no action at all. But on this October morning, that was all about to change. Alan Palmer, in his book Banner of Battle, has written of the engagement. He says, General Scarlet's dragoons were already heading westward to protect the Turks when they sighted the glint of Cossack lance heads above the ridge of the causeway as the main Russian cavalry force bore down on the village of Kadikoy. Scarlet halted the advance. He was beginning to dress his 3 squadrons into line when Lord Lucan galloped up and ordered the Heavy Brigade at once to charge the Russians. Although Scarlet was reluctant to be hurried by an overexcited divisional commander, he seems to have ordered the trumpeter to sound the charge so suddenly that Brigadier and aide-de-camp were well in front of the Greys and Inniskillings, who formed the first line of galloping horsemen. In other words, Scarlet was right at the forefront. It chanced that at this moment Russian commander Rizhov's cavalry were actually stationary, for their general was about to redeploy them after the frustrating check imposed by Campbell's Thin Red Line. The Heavy Brigade therefore fell upon their enemy with all the ferocity of armoured knights in the Middle Ages. Amongst the heavies that day was the incredibly named Richard Temple, Godman of the 5th Dragoon Guards. That's him on screen. He's left us with this first-hand account of the fighting. The Greys and Enniskillings went first, then we came in support of the Greys. The enemy's front must have been composed of 3 regiments and a very strong column in their rear. In all, I suppose, about 1,500 or 2,000 men, while we were not more than 800. However, the charge sounded, and at them went the first line, Scarlet and his ADC well in front. The enemy seemed quite astonished and drew into a walk and then a halt. As soon as they met, all I saw was swords in the air in every direction, the pistols going off, and everyone hacking away right and left. In a moment the Greys were surrounded and hemmed completely in. There they were fighting back to back in the middle, the great bearskin caps high above the enemy. This was the work of a moment. As soon as we saw it, the 5th advanced and in they charged, yelling and shouting as hard as they could. The row was tremendous, and for about 5 minutes neither would give way, and their column was so deep we could not cut through it. At length they turned, and well they might, and the whole ran as hard as they could back up the hill, our men after them, cutting them down right and left. We pursued for about 300 yards, and then the gunners opened up on them and gave them a fine peppering. It took some little time to get the men to fall in again. They were all mixed up together, of course, all the regiments in one mass. The ground was strewn with swords, broken and whole, trumpets, helmets, carbines, etc. There must have been some 40 or 50 of the enemy dead besides wounded. All the wounded were, of course, immediately taken off. Lord Raglan, who was looking down from a hill close by, sent an ADC to say, "Well done the heavies." The hand-to-hand fighting was indeed pretty brutal stuff and took the Russian hussars by surprise. General Rizhov was to recall later in old age, "In 42 years of service and 10 campaigns, among them Culm, Leipzig and Paris, never before have I seen such action with both sides cutting and thrusting at each other for so long." Now it's worth pointing out here that Scarlet and his small HQ element, who as you recall were right at the front, they were in the thick of things throughout. Scarlet's said to have suffered 5 wounds, and his ADC, Alexander Elliot, received a staggering 14 wounds. In reality, the action was short, probably lasting 10 minutes, but the Russians were decisively driven from the field. It was incredible work against tremendous odds. And casualties? Hard to say. The Russians may have lost around 300 men, though that's likely an exaggeration. As for the British, official figures show 10 killed and 98 wounded across the whole brigade. But more than half of those were probably from after the charge, while they were stuck passively supporting the Light Brigade's suicidal dash. As Anglesey says in Volume 2 of his History of the British Cavalry, casualties were surprisingly light, and he says this was partly due to the inefficiency of the swords on both sides. "Our swords," wrote Lieutenant Colonel Griffiths, commanding the Greys, "are very defective. When our men made a thrust with the sword, they all bent and would not go into a man's body. They're quite unfit for active service." But having said that, some of the doctors who dealt with the casualties noticed that some of the Russian dead had had their skull cleft in two down to the chin. From this we can infer that when the edge was used against the head, it did serious damage, rather than the point of the sword, which actually struggled to break through the thick material of the Russians' greatcoats. As well as their spirit and hefty sword arm, another reason for the success of the charge was the excellent work of C Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery. One witness later said of their actions, "The Russians halted short of the ridge and their officers could be seen holding their swords up and endeavouring to rally them and get them into order, which they very soon would have done. But C Troop now came into action and fired 49 shot and shell at them at a range of between 700 and 800 yards with admirable results. The 24-pounder howitzers making splendid practice. This effectually prevented the Russians rallying and they quickly retired." And before we wrap up, I also need to draw attention to this chap. What a stud. His name is Henry Ramage. He was a sergeant with the Scots Greys. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions that day, and it says on Victoria Cross Online, "At the battle he galloped out to the assistance of his colleague Private Macpherson of the same regiment. Macpherson was surrounded by 7 Russians who Ramage chopped his way through, saving his comrade's life. Also the same day he brought in a prisoner from the Russian lines, and while covering the retreat of the Light Brigade, rescued Private Gardner, who was disabled with a severe leg fracture. Ramage carried him to safety in the rear under heavy fire, saving his life. He went on to serve in the Indian Mutiny, but he sadly died in 1859, and it says here he was buried in an unmarked grave in Newbridge Cemetery. A sad end for a great man. Anyway, thanks to all these brave deeds, Balaclava was now saved. The heavy cavalry had performed brilliantly and deserved to be remembered for their achievement. Subscribe and watch the video that's on screen now. I'll be back with more incredible stories from British military history very soon. I'll see you then.